In the latter half of the 19th century, death was not merely an ending, but a cultural obsession, a subject woven into the fabric of daily life with a mixture of reverence, ritual, and quiet horror. The Victorians, gripped by the shadow of epidemics and the ever-present fragility of life, sought ways to keep their lost loved ones close, if not in body, then in memory, and often in both. Post-mortem photography captured faces stilled forever in one last portrait. Hair was woven into mourning jewelry and worn around the neck as a token of eternal closeness. Coffins were built with viewing panes, bells, and locks to comfort the living with the illusion of permanence or even the faint possibility of return. It was an age when science and superstition walked hand in hand, and nowhere is this eerie intersection more vividly embodied than in the story of Sarah Gray. Sarah was only a child when she died in 1873, taken before her time by an illness that left her family broken with grief. But unlike many of her peers who were laid into the cold earth, Sarah was placed within a coffin of unusual design, a glass-sealed chamber, constructed not only to preserve her tiny frame, but also to preserve the memory of her innocence. What began as a grieving family's attempt to defy decay soon became a tale that drifted into legend. For decades after her burial, whispers spread of a strange phenomenon, that Sarah's eyes, once closed in eternal rest, had appeared to open, gazing outward as though the child still lingered between life and death. The case of Sarah Gray's glass coffin became one of the most unsettling curiosities of Victorian mortuary lore, a story where mourning ritual gave way to myth, and the line between preservation and resurrection blurred in the flicker of half-open eyes. Little is known of Sarah Gray's short life, but what survives in fragments and folklore paints the outline of a child caught between the ordinary rhythms of Victorian England and the extraordinary fate that would make her name endure. Born in the early 1860s, she was the daughter of a modest, middle-class family, raised at a time when childhood was both sentimentalized and perilously fragile. In an age before modern medicine, children rarely escaped the perils of scarlet fever, cholera, or tuberculosis, and even the smallest cough could be an omen of tragedy. Neighbors would later recall Sarah as a pale, quiet girl with large, thoughtful eyes, a child who clutched her doll on walks and lingered longer than most at church services. To her parents, she was the embodiment of innocence, a fragile pearl in a world of soot and sickness. In 1873, when Sarah was no more than 10 years old, illness struck suddenly. Whether it was diphtheria or another fever remains uncertain, but accounts agree she faded quickly, her breath shallow, her body weakening over the course of mere days. Doctors could do little more than prescribe rest, tonics, and prayers. Within the week, Sarah Gray was gone, leaving her household steeped in silence, broken only by the muffled sobs of her mother. For the Grays, the prospect of surrendering their child to the damp earth was unbearable. In their grief, they resolved upon an unusual memorial, one that would allow them to look upon her still face as though she merely slept. Thus, the decision was made for a coffin like no other, a chamber of glass, airtight and unyielding, to hold their daughter not as a corpse, but as a preserved image of purity. What began as an act of desperate love would mark the first chapter of a story that would ripple outward in whispers and legend for generations to come. The decision to place Sarah Gray in a glass coffin was not born from idle extravagance, but from the deep currents of grief and devotion that swept through her family after her sudden death. In the 1870s, such contrivances were rare but not entirely unheard of. The Victorian fascination with death had given rise to innovations both practical and bizarre. Coffins fitted with breathing tubes to guard against premature burial, caskets with glass windows to allow mourners one final glimpse, and experimental embalming techniques designed to cheat the natural process of decay. To the grieving Gray family, these ideas promised a small comfort, that Sarah's angelic face might be preserved against the ravages of time. The coffin was commissioned from a craftsman who specialized in unusual funerary constructions. A man whispered to have made vessels for wealthy families who wished to display their dead, as though they still slept. Constructed of oak and iron, but lined with glass panels, the chamber was said to be sealed with pitch and resin, its interior treated with chemicals that slowed the onset of decomposition. For her parents, this was no grotesque curiosity, but an act of desperate love. If Sarah must leave them, then let her be encased in clarity, untouched by earth, forever visible through the crystalline barrier. When the coffin was completed, Sarah's body was dressed in a white gown, her hair brushed smooth, and a small rosary placed between her hands. To those who attended the funeral, the sight was unsettling yet strangely peaceful, like gazing upon a doll rather than a lifeless child. As the coffin was lowered into the grave, neighbors whispered of the oddness of such a burial, but the family believed they had safeguarded their daughter's memory in a way ordinary soil could never allow. They could not know that this act of grief would set into motion one of the most chilling legends of Victorian funerary lore. For a time, Sarah Gray's resting place drew little more than quiet curiosity. The coffin, sealed beneath layers of earth, lay hidden from daily sight, and the grieving family attempted to resume their lives, clinging to the comfort that their daughter remained preserved in her glass chamber. Yet as the years passed, stories began to stir among townsfolk, whispered first in hushed tones, then repeated with the certainty of folklore. Visitors to the cemetery spoke of an odd clarity to the soil above her grave, as though the earth itself refused to conceal her. Some claimed that caretakers, during routine maintenance, caught sight of her face through a patch of fog glass exposed to the air. What unsettled them most was not her preservation alone, but the suggestion of movement, the faint impression that her eyelids, once firmly shut, had parted ever so slightly. These tales spread with the fervor of superstition. Children dared one another to visit Sarah's grave at dusk, while adults spoke of her as a quiet miracle, a child who defied the natural laws of decay. Some believed she was a saint, her incorruptible body a sign of divine favor. Others whispered darker theories, that she had not truly died, that she lingered in some twilight state, conscious beneath the glass. The most chilling rumor insisted that when the moonlight struck the coffin at just the right angle, Sarah's eyes reflected the glow, appearing to gaze outward with a soft, haunting awareness. Whether born of optical illusion, shifting soil, or pure invention, the legend grew until Sarah Gray's grave became more than a place of mourning. It became a destination. Mourners, curiosity seekers, and those fascinated with death traveled to glimpse the child said to have opened her eyes from beyond the grave. In this way, a simple act of grief transformed into an enduring myth, one that blurred the fragile boundary between love, memory, and the supernatural. The rumors surrounding Sarah Gray's glass coffin might have remained idle cemetery tales were it not for the handful of accounts that seemed to give them weight. Over the decades following her burial, there were occasions when the ground around her grave needed tending, and in those moments, the strange coffin was once again brought into view. Grave diggers and caretakers, hardened men not easily shaken, spoke in uneasy voices of what they had seen. They described Sarah's body as eerily intact, her skin pale but not withered, her features preserved with the serenity of sleep. What unsettled them most was the suggestion that her eyes, once sealed in eternal rest, appeared slightly parted, as though death itself had failed to hold her gaze shut. One tale, retold countless times in taverns and parlors, involved an attempted grave robbery. Lured by rumors of valuables buried with the girl, a pair of thieves sought to break into the coffin under cover of night. According to the story, they fled in terror before completing their task, swearing that as they wiped the condensation from the glass, Sarah's eyes glimmered in the moonlight, staring back at them with a faint but unmistakable awareness. Another account claimed that when officials briefly opened part of the chamber decades later to inspect its condition, a thin mist escaped, and within the fog glass Sarah's lashes were visible, fragile, delicate, as though frozen in time. Whether true or embellished, these stories only deepened the coffin's infamy. To believers, they were proof of divine mystery or restless spirit. To skeptics, they were merely tricks of light, of condensation, or the imaginative exaggerations of frightened men. Yet each retelling added a layer of dread, ensuring that Sarah Gray was no longer just a child laid to rest. She had become a figure of Victorian legend, her silent vigil beneath the glass a source of both fascination and fear. As Sarah Gray's legend grew, so too did the attempts to explain it. The Victorians, after all, lived in an age caught between faith and science, when the mysteries of death were probed with microscopes even as seances filled parlors across England. For every mourner who whispered of miracles, there was a physician or chemist willing to suggest a more earthly cause. The preservation of Sarah's body, they argued, was not evidence of sanctity, but of circumstance. Her glass coffin, sealed tightly with resin, may have created a near-airtight environment that slowed decomposition. Certain soils, rich in minerals and cool in temperature, were known to act as natural preservatives. Combined with the embalming compound applied at her burial, arsenic, alum, or formaldehyde derivatives, the conditions could have delayed decay far beyond what was typical. But what of her eyes, the most chilling detail of all? Here, too, science offered possible answers. Bodies are not static after death. Gases build within, tissues shift, and eyelids that were once neatly shut can loosen, revealing a sliver of the cornea beneath. Condensation forming on the coffin's inner glass might have refracted light in such a way that mourners perceived movement where there was none. The glimmer of moonlight against glass could give the illusion of open eyes, a trick magnified by fear and expectation. To the rational mind, Sarah's so-called awakening was no more than a confluence of chemistry, environment, and imagination. Yet science could not fully erase the unease. For those who had seen her face themselves, pale, serene, and strangely lifelike, explanations rang hollow. In an age that revered progress yet longed for proof of the soul's endurance, Sarah Gray's coffin stood at the crossroads, a testament to both the limits of science and the boundless power of belief. By the turn of the 20th century, Sarah Gray's glass coffin had passed from whispered rumor into enduring folklore. Her grave was no longer just a resting place, but a destination, a site of pilgrimage for the curious, the grieving, and the morbidly fascinated. Locals spoke of her with a mixture of pride and unease, as though their town had been marked by a quiet miracle or a lingering curse. For some, Sarah became a symbol of incorruptibility, a child saint preserved by divine hand. For others, she embodied the uncanny side of Victorian mourning culture, where the line between memorial and spectacle blurred until the dead seemed to linger among the living. Travelers came from neighboring counties, and later from farther afield, hoping to glimpse the child who never truly closed her eyes. Writers of the macabre included her story in pamphlets and penny dreadfuls, framing her as a ghostly guardian of the cemetery. Spiritualists, eager for proof of life after death, cited her as evidence that the soul could inhabit the body long after the final breath. Even skeptics, though dismissive of miracles, admitted that the preservation was unusual and that the aura surrounding Sarah's grave could not be explained away by science alone. In time, the legend became woven into the town's identity. Parents frightened unruly children with warnings that Sarah was watching from her coffin, while mourners placed flowers at her grave not out of kinship, but out of reverence for what she represented. Though the coffin itself eventually succumbed to the slow ravages of age, glass clouded, seals weakened, earth pressed heavier, the myth of Sarah Gray never decayed. Instead, it grew, transforming her from a child lost to illness into a figure who haunted memory itself. A fragile body preserved in crystal, eyes that might open at any moment, and a story that refused, like the girl had described, to rest in peace. The tale of Sarah Gray's glass coffin lingers not because it promises proof of miracles, but because it embodies the deepest paradox of mourning, the desire to let go and the refusal to release. Her family, shattered by loss, sought a way to preserve her innocence against the corrosive touch of time, and in doing so created a vessel that blurred the fragile boundary between life and death. Whether her eyes ever truly opened, or whether they only seemed to in the minds of grieving onlookers, scarcely matters now. What endures is the way her story unsettles us, reflecting both the Victorian hunger for permanence and our own unease at the inevitability of decay. In Sarah's preserved form, one can see the collision of two worlds: the rationalist century that sought to master death with chemicals, inventions, and glass, and the superstitious heart that still longed for signs that the spirit lingered. She became a symbol not only of Victorian excess, but of universal longing, the hope that those we love might never entirely leave us, that memory might hold flesh and spirit in suspension. And yet, as her legend spread, she was transformed from a grieving family's child into a figure claimed by strangers, her story retold until it belonged less to history than to myth. Today, the image of Sarah Gray endures as both comfort and warning. Comfort in the thought of innocence preserved beyond corruption. Warning in the reminder that death, no matter how encased in glass, cannot be conquered, only delayed. Her coffin, her legend, and her unblinking gaze remind us that the Victorians were not so different from us. They too sought permanence, and they too found only the haunting persistence of memory. Sarah Gray, child of grief and glass, remains unforgotten because she seems never to have closed her eyes.